Hello, I'm John Darling. The statistics surrounding DUI are staggering. One study reports that in the United States alone, a human life is taken once every 23 minutes as the result of a DUI crash. But this video is not about statistics. It's not about numbers. It's about the people behind the numbers, the people who've lost their lives, and the people whose lives will forever be changed by what we call impaired driving. Our first story is about a warm, caring, generous man who was not only loved by his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, but also by the countless number of people whose lives he had touched. Richard Thomas Kennedy was a big fan of the University of Florida Gators, and on September 8, 1990, he took a trip to Gainesville to see his favorite team play. But because of a DUI accident, he never made it home.
My dad was one of those persons that never met a stranger. He was just a jovial, well-educated, smart man that could talk with anybody. He held us together for years. We're all so different people, but he always accepted us for what we were. It didn't matter. One of us went one direction. We were all different type of people, but to Dad, it was unconditional love. We're his daughters. We had people over all the time at the holiday time, the kids that couldn't go home for the season because it was too expensive to go home, or families didn't want them. We had a huge table full of people because Dad was that kind of person. You don't have anywhere to go, come on home with us. My family, we'll take you in, no problem. You know, it was just the way it was. It was one big happy family. It was around 11:30 in the evening. I had seen my father, the night before and talked with him for a short while. He was all excited about going up to Gainesville. But when I opened the door, there was a police officer standing there. He told me that the car that was registered in the accident, the tag was registered next door. At that point, I thought my knees were going to give out. I then went over to where my mother works and had to tell her that Dad was in a bad accident and that we need to leave now and we need to get home and get packed. That night is a terrible memory. I never want to have to do that to my mother again. The seats from the car, the bolts were broken from the frame of the car. It was hit so severely. My father had his seatbelt on, but with the seat being broken, he was thrown around the car, hit his head, his pelvis came up and hit on the steering wheel, his head hit on the windshield. He finally, what we were told from his friend, fell over in his lap and said, "Oh my God," and that was it. He never spoke again. It took them over an hour to get them out of the car by finally cutting off the roof of the car. The young lady that hit my father only had a broken wrist and a small scratch on her face, had to ride in the ambulance with my father to Shands because she was an employee of Shands, and that's where her insurance said she needed to go. I wouldn't have wanted to take that ride that she had to have taken and saw what she saw for anything in the world, because I know he was in full code by what we were told. They were intubating him. They were giving him all kind of meds. He was very severely tore up, and she had to have seen it, the effect of what she did. I don't know where his eyes were. His face was so badly tore up. His head was swollen out so severely over its ears from the trauma. There was such severe intracranial pressure. They had gauges in his head to check the pressure. He was intubated. He wasn't breathing on his own. His teeth were gone. By the autopsy report later, we found that all his teeth were in his stomach. The impact was so severe. His nose was flattened. His whole face was tore up. His abdomen was also completely tore up from the impact of the steering wheel. By the time we got there at 4:30, he had already been transfused with 13 units of blood. He was bleeding out as fast as they were putting it in him. The only thing recognizable of him was his hands, and they were pretty swollen, but his hands was the only thing I could recognize. I remember looking down at his feet, and they were gray. They were cold. There was no circulation to his lower extremities. I'm sorry. When we went in to see him, being a nurse, I believe that the hearing is the last thing to go. I felt like somebody was still there, even though he wasn't able to respond to us. And I talked with him, and I cried, and I promised him a lot of things, as you do. But his pulse would pick up. You could see on the monitors that something there was reacting. But he was just too weak to fight it. We had the priest come in and give him last rites. Sunday evening, somewhere around 9 o'clock, the doctors came in and said the pressure was getting too severe, that they had no choice. They had to take him down to the operating room. He never made it off the operating table. This was a 21-year-old woman who had gone out that night, had gotten mad at her boyfriend, and went over to friend's house and drank pretty excessively. Friends let her get back in her car and proceed to drive home. All over a fight with a boyfriend, she killed my father and paralyzed John, and the woman in front of my father also received some serious injury. When she was finally charged, it was about a month later that we were notified by the police in Gainesville that she had killed herself. She went home one night after drinking with friends and took the pills that the psychiatrist had given her and put a bag over her head and lay down on the couch, and that was it. So she not only that night, by that decision to drive, took my father's life. Later, John did die from complications, took his life. Now her family is having to come down from out of state and take a 21-year-old child back home and bury their only child. Please, just, if you're had a drink or any kind of impairment, don't get behind a wheel. That decision to get behind a wheel not only affects you, it affects the person you hit, it affects the person, their family, it spirals on down. And that one decision can ruin your life and ruin the lives of the victims forever.
88 miles per hour. Just switched off it. Oh boy.
We see a very large percentage of the patients that we have involve alcohol.
It's necessary to tell this family that the patient may not survive.
Yvonne Pearson was far from being your average teenager. She was exceptionally intelligent, extremely generous, and according to her mom and dad, a whole lot of fun to be around. One look at Yvonne, and it's easy to see that this was not only a young lady with dreams in her eyes, but a young lady capable of making those dreams come true.
She was just a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun with her. I enjoyed my daughter. I really enjoyed her.
There were a lot of things that I enjoyed about her that I didn't realize at the time were as valuable as they are.
She had gone from kindergarten to 8th grade with the same kids, and she still kept in contact with them. She still talked to them and checked up on them and would give them anything. Usually the clothes off her back, and she did that quite a few times too. You need this? Oh, here, have it. It was not, like Dennis said, self-centered. It was just, you know, what can I give you? What do you need? It was just giving to them, taking care of them. I got a phone call at 1 a.m. in the morning on June 19th, 1992. And of course, you're always scared because we had 3 teenagers at the time, and 2 of them were out. Andy and Yvonne were out for a party. Partying, as Yvonne would call it. It was her first night off all week from work. She says, I'm going out to play. I said, take it easy, little girl, love you. And the guy at the phone said, I'm from Bayfront Trauma Center. He says, do you have a daughter named Yvonne Myers? And I said, yes. And he says, was she out with Matt? I said, I think that's his last name. And he says, does he have a red Firebird? I said, yes. He says, well, we have reason to believe we have your daughter here at Bayfront Center Trauma Unit. And he says, do you have a way there? And I said, yeah, my husband will take me. And I called my mom and said, meet us there. And I called my girlfriend and said, start praying. And we went down there and got into the hospital, and they pulled us into a little room. And the chaplain said, I have to explain to you that she's already been coded twice, which means her heart's stopped. We started it again when we took her out of the car, and we had to start it again when we took her out of the helicopter. and we need you to identify her body. So they took us into the trauma unit, and all she had was one little cut on her face and this blanket on the, you know, her blankets up to her neck. So that's Yvonne, and they shut off the machine, and we got to watch her heart die just like you do on TV. You know, the beeps just get smaller and smaller. It's rough watching your daughter die on a monitor like that. Then they walked out of there and they handed us this envelope, and it's got all her stuff in it. It's got her keychain and necklace, some ID, because there's no clothes left. They destroyed those trying to keep her alive. It's rough.
Here was my daughter laying there, and I was being told that there was nothing more that could be done. And it wasn't a question of money. It wasn't a question of technology. It wasn't a question of help. There was absolutely nothing that could be done.
These are real people that are dying. These are real kids that are not being able to grow up. I never get to be the mother of the bride. Going to a wedding that first time after she died was really rough. I'll never get to be the mother of the bride. I don't get to have grandchildren from my daughter. As Dennis used to tease her constantly. When you get married and have kids, because she always said, I'm not going to get married for a long time. I'm not going to have kids. And he'd tease her and tease her and tease her. When you get married and have kids, I'm going to sugar them up and send them home. And it was the only one of all 5 kids that he's ever teased that way, you know, because she would always say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to travel the world, and I'm going to see it all, and I'm going to do everything before I have kids. And he'd say, no, you're going to have kids, and I'm going to sugar them up and send them home. And it's not going to happen.
Driving fast and drinking is not what killed. The car was moving at 20 miles per hour when it pulled into the path of another car. The driver was drunk. He knew he was drunk. He was being very cautious. You cannot drive when you are inhibited. You can make a split-second mistake that will change your life and the lives of others. Nothing will work if they won't stop and think for themselves.
Stand up, stand up.
No, we can't fix everything. There are, unfortunately, people that we lose.
3 of them have been killed, and 2 of them are seriously injured. Their ages for all 5 of them are ranging from 17 to 20. It looks like it might be alcohol related.
DUI fatalities not only rock the lives of the surviving friends and family, they also have an everlasting effect on the impaired driver. The 2 offenders in this video are both in recovery. Neither drinks today. And as you listen to their stories, rather than judge, you may just want to try to learn from their mistakes. Our first offender, Daphne R., talks about living with the nightmare that she took the life of a 7-year-old child.
I remember asking a couple of people who I really thought were my friends not to let me drive, you know, just take me home and you can take my car. Because I've had 3 priors before the DUI manslaughter, and nobody would drive me. Everybody had other plans, so I got in my car and I drove myself. I didn't make it a mile down the road, and I remember seeing headlights, and that's all I remember. I was there in the emergency room for a few hours before they even said anything to me about somebody had died in the other car. It was a mother and a child, her child, and her granddaughter. Her daughter, 7, is the one that died. I remember the homicide report read something to the effects of her head hitting the dashboard and a lung collapsing and filling up with blood. It was on January the 9th when the police officers came and they charged me officially with DUI manslaughter, 2 counts of DUI causing serious bodily injury.
I'm not sure how bad the mother was hurt in the accident, but I have heard that her granddaughter's eye, one of her eyes, she's blind in it now. I was sentenced to 10 years in prison. I got, well, actually it was a sentence of 35 years. It was five-year sentences running concurrent with the 10-year sentence, which was for the DUI manslaughter. I sat in jail. They took me right from the courtroom to the jail. I sat there a little over a week. On the 16th, I was transferred to Florida Correctional Institution for Women. It's still hard every day, today, realizing that I'm responsible for somebody's life being taken. I would say to that victim that this is hard. To try to see me through God's eyes. That's the way I have to look at me today. And I'm sorry. My message to whoever feels the need to drink and drive is don't do it. Nothing good can come out of it, and it kills. It's just deadly. It's no game, and it kills people.
End of it. I want you to stand right. I want you to stand.
You drink too much. Call somebody. Do something that makes some sense.
Some of the injuries that people do suffer can be worse than dying, really.
You're in the hospital.
Like many hospitals across the country, Bayfront Medical Center provides emergency trauma services to the victims of DUI crashes. State-of-the-art equipment and highly trained and dedicated professionals do everything in their power to help save these innocent victims. But sometimes the damage done to the human body is so severe that not even these modern-day heroes can help, and the patient dies. When that happens, one of Bayfront's chaplains goes to work.
Sooner or later, we figure out who the person is and make the phone call that everyone dreads receiving. I'll identify myself. I usually don't say I'm a chaplain because that just throws a little extra layer of fear in the hearts of the family members that probably isn't helpful right then, but we'll simply say that my name is Mark Peterson and I'm calling from Bayfront Medical Center emergency room and ask them if they're a relative of the patient. And they'll typically say yes, and then I'll simply say that there's been an accident and they need to come to the hospital right away. There's no easy way to give bad news, but there are better ways to do it and some not so good ways to do it. My experience has been that it's important to do it personally, which is to do it face-to-face, as opposed to over the telephone. So even if a patient has died, I really would rather have the family come here to the hospital if that's possible, so we can meet with them one-on-one. The second thing to do is to do it privately. As I have said, it's good to be in a room like this, so if people have a strong emotional reaction, they can do that without undue influences from others. And the third way to give bad news is to do it plainly. Use language that you know that they can understand, words that are common to us all, which is why if, for example, the patient has died, I tend not to use the word expired. Our driver's licenses expire, library books expire, but patients die. And, people absorb things like this in little bits anyway. You consume as much of bad news as you can, and then oftentimes people sort of close down and don't either give or receive information anymore. There's a wonderful author, a rabbi named Harold Kushner, who once said the best thing to do with grieving people is tell them you're sorry and then shut your mouth. I think typically that's what we do here at the hospital, is we'll share the news that needs to be shared and then sit quietly with the people as they absorb it. People don't hear very much of what you have to say anyway, but they'll remember that you were there and that you seemed to care. Consuming a small amount of alcohol seems to almost immediately rob you of good sense. And so we see people in here who've caused accidents who have a blood alcohol rate that would come from only having a couple of beers, a glass of wine, because their ability to think clearly was almost immediately erased, and so they made a mistake that ended up having incredibly terrible consequences. I suppose the emotion that's hardest to deal with and hardest to absolve is guilt. People who have caused pain to themselves usually just feel stupid. Those who have caused pain to others tend to feel incredible guilt, and guilt is a feeling that doesn't easily go away. We see the beginning of it here, but I'm very aware that it goes on for years and years and years. There's a lot of wisdom in having designated drivers. That's what we do in my family and circle of friends, and someone needs to be responsible ahead of time and agree to do that. Otherwise, just stay home. You don't want me to call you in the middle of the night. You don't want me to be the one that meets you at the back door of the hospital. And you sure don't want to come in a room like this and sit down with me and a physician and have to hear the kind of news I'm going to have to give you, because your life will be changed forever.
Part of the test is for you to be able to walk down the line Can't do it? Okay. We'll go on to the next one here.
No, it's okay. We don't give warnings when it comes to drunk drivers, because I look at it this way: you can't give a warning to somebody who dies.
I believe that you are impaired. At this point, I am.
I
right.
will admit. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't think you should have been driving, so right now I am going to go ahead and place you under arrest for DUI. We do our best to try to keep the intoxicated people off the roadway to save their lives or probably someone else's.
Not all victims of DUI crashes are killed. Many nursing homes and families house patients that are severely brain damaged, totally paralyzed, or even lying comatose, all because somebody put the key in the ignition and the gear shift and drive when they had no business being behind the wheel. As a teenager, Travis Reinhold was involved in a DUI crash that killed 4 other teens. Incidentally, Travis was driving alone in his car and did not know the 4 teens that died. 7 years later, Travis faces even more surgery and to this day prefers not to talk about the accident. As you listen to Travis's mom, Pat, describe how his face was literally crushed and the long and painful road to recovery, it's easy to understand why Travis wants to put that night behind him.
My youngest son calls a little bit afterwards and said, "Mom, there's been an accident." I said, "Okay." I said, "When is Travis coming home?" And he said, "Mom, there's been an accident." And I said again, "When is Travis coming home?" And he said, "Mom, Travis is in the accident." There was a 17-year-old boy who had a BAC of .11 and 4 other kids in his car that was driving on the wrong side of the road, did not try to avoid the crash, and struck Travis head on. And the drunk driver or impaired driver died at the scene along with 2 other young adults, and 1 girl survived out of that car and another boy died 4 days afterwards at Bayfront. And I remember staring at Travis, who was basically conscious at the time, and I couldn't believe that this was his face. I could not believe this was his face. I couldn't understand at that time how a body could break apart like that. I just couldn't understand it. You know, to watch your child and to realize there's nothing you could do to help him, it's a horrible, horrible feeling. It's horrible. His sinuses were crushed, his palate was crushed, his cheekbones were fractured, and his condyles up here were crushed. His parotid gland also was damaged on both sides. Every time he had the surgery done, they would wire him shut for about 12 weeks. And somebody always had to sleep in the room with him because you didn't want him to choke to death. Also, he had to wear a wire clipper around his neck all the time in case he started to choke. He was told to pick up the clipper, to go in and to cut the wires so he would be able to get air in. But he had to go at one time for 8 root canals. And about a year after the crash, he had to go in for surgery again, where they actually lowered the upper teeth, the upper jaw, and they brought it down some, and they shot it with freeze-dried bone to rebuild his face. It's 7 years after, and recently an implant failed, so he has to go back again to have that implant redone. And again, they will graft an area from the roof of his mouth to put along the side to rebuild the area and to shoot in some freeze-dried bone or cadaver bone. Sometimes he wanted to eat by himself because he was embarrassed that he couldn't keep the food in his mouth because he was still recovering and he didn't have all the sensations back in his mouth. And it was heartbreaking to watch him because you couldn't do anything for him other than follow the doctor's advice and be very supportive, but you couldn't take his place. You couldn't send him back to school and say everything's going to be fine. I think the problem, what really shocked me, was after Travis was injured, there were a fair amount of our friends who still allowed their teens, underage teens, to drink. And I really just couldn't understand why, but they really had the thinking, it won't happen to me. It just won't happen to me. We never think we're going to be dealing with a DUI injury, or a DUI fatality. It's always going to be somebody else. And what's devastating is the parent that thinks a couple of beers won't hurt. The kid carried, because he promised me he wouldn't drink and drive, and then the kid all of a sudden feels, I'm okay and I really can drive, and he doesn't make it home that night because he really couldn't drive. And the parent has to deal with the fact, I basically handed him a gun to shoot himself with.
When you give a death notification, it's one of the hardest jobs that I can think of in our law enforcement career.
Not all DUI accidents happen late at night at high speeds. Leo M. was on his way to pick up his girlfriend from a doctor's appointment. It was the middle of the afternoon. Leo stopped to have a few beers and some lunch. On the way back from the doctor's office, his car was struck by another vehicle and his girlfriend was killed. Because Leo's blood alcohol level was above the legal limit, he was held responsible for the death of his girlfriend.
I was involved in a very tragic accident back in 1992. I was driving down US 19. I was driving, my girlfriend was the passenger, and I was hit by another car. What happened was the ambulance came and my girlfriend was taken to Bayfront Hospital. I was taken to another hospital because her injuries were worse than mine. And come to find out, my girlfriend died 3 hours later. While I was at the hospital getting fixed up, they went ahead and they drew blood. And they found out I had been drinking. What happened was I ended up getting arrested for DUI manslaughter. I ended up going to prison for 8.5 years on a DUI manslaughter charge because I was drinking. The families involved, my family was really devastated by what had happened and with my involvement in the accident. My girlfriend's family was totally destroyed by losing their daughter. Due to my drinking and the way everything turned out with the accident, the loss of my girlfriend's life, My imprisonment, me ending up in drug and alcohol centers has completely changed my life around. I wouldn't touch a drink right now if my life depended on it, knowing that I might possibly have to go through all the emotional trauma, the hurt, and all the hurt I've caused from this accident.
What would you say to your girlfriend if you could say anything to her?
That I'm sorry that this happened. If I had known my drinking was gonna cause her death, I would have never ever had a drink to begin with. If you plan on having a couple drinks and thinking that it's all right to go ahead and get behind the wheel, I wouldn't if I were you.
Yeah, she's breathing. Oh yes, we got her attention now.
We have specially trained investigators, deputies that go out there and they can identify these impaired drivers and then take them to jail.
I am going to place you under arrest for DUI.
Get a designated driver.
Our final story involves a young, bright, and very talented songwriter and musician. Jeff Lemieux's bands played at a number of popular Bay Area nightclubs. It's anybody's guess just how far Jeff may have gone in the music industry. But unfortunately, we'll never know. Jeff's life was taken by a drunk driver. That drunk driver was Jeff's lifelong best friend.
He was so outgoing, always a smile on his face. Everybody loved him. He had lots of friends. He was one of the happiest people. Every picture we have, he was laughing, smiling, joking. Actually, he was the life of the party anywhere he went. Thanksgiving, Christmas, when the family was here, everybody was together. It was Jeff that kept us all laughing. In fact, he could sit there and I think our dinner would get cold before we could stop laughing long enough to eat when Jeff was around. He was always a happy person. He used to write his own music. He loved to play classical guitar, even though when he was out with his friends and playing with his band, he played rock music, but classical was what he loved. George and Jeff met when they were probably in 7th grade. They were maybe 12, 13 years old, or maybe a little younger. And they formed an instant friendship. Of course, they were so much alike. They were both funny, happy, friendly. They were always happy and always spending time together. About 9 o'clock on that Sunday morning, a police officer and a victim's advocate came to my door. They said that Jeff had been killed that morning in a car crash. Jeff died instantly. They say his brainstem was severed, so we're thankful he didn't suffer. He was gone within a matter of seconds, they tell me. It was about 24 hours after the crash. George was being released from the hospital and Jeff was being released to the funeral home. We did make the arrangements that day. As we were sitting there, standing in the parking lot, an officer came and arrested George for DUI manslaughter. That was almost a shock at that time because I think we did not know that this was why the crash happened. We were not told the details. And it was much later that we were told that actually on that 2-lane highway, or 2-lane road I should say, in Oldsmar, on a curve that was a very dangerous curve at this high speed. He was traveling 90 miles an hour around that curve. That was the end of Jeffrey's life and probably the beginning of the end of George's. He'll never be the same, never. I can't imagine waking up every day and having to face another day knowing that you've taken a life, that somebody has died because you used such poor judgment. The night of the crash, Jeff had gone out with a girl and apparently came home about 1:30, and that's when they went out to celebrate George's birthday and the crash. For the rest of his life, George is going to wake up on his birthday. He'll never, ever be able to celebrate it again without thinking of Jeff. It's another life destroyed, and his friend is gone. So his life, I would think, is going to be very, very difficult from now on. He's always going to remember Jeff with a lot of sadness, I'm sure, a lot of memories, because they were good friends. Okay, we stop. It's still hard to believe. It's like some days we still think maybe he'll walk through the door. There's definitely an empty spot here where Jeff used to be. Sorry. You get out there, you drink, you drive. Somebody might get hurt, you might make it. You might get home 10 times, but the 11th time you might lose a friend. You might lose a perfect stranger, but it's somebody's son, it's somebody's husband, maybe somebody's wife, a small child, and they don't deserve to die for your inability to think and control the vehicle that you're driving.
Could you step out, please?
We want you to take control of your car.
In the process of putting this video together, we had the privilege of meeting some wonderful and brave folks that, although their own lives have been changed by personal tragedy, they've come forward to show us that driving down the road out of control is not a game, it's not a joke, and it's not funny. People do die. Every single participant told me that if they can save at least one life by their involvement in this video, then maybe their own suffering has not been completely in vain. Don't let them down. If you have a drinking or a drug problem, get help. But until then, don't get behind the wheel impaired. Trust me, you don't want to end up in a video like this. For the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, I'm John Darling.
8 miles per hour.
We see a very large percentage of the patients that we have involve alcohol.
It's necessary to tell this family that the patient may not survive.
No, we can't fix everything. There are unfortunately people that we lose.
3 of them have been killed and 2 of them were seriously injured. Their ages for all 5 of them are ranging 17 to 20. It looks like it might be alcohol related.
Just stand right. I want you to
You drink too much. Call somebody. Do something that makes some sense.
Some of the injuries that people do suffer can be worse than dying, really.